When Lee Kuan Yew stepped down in 1990, Singapore wasn't just a success story, it was an economic miracle written against every odd. In 1965, this tiny island, barely half the size of Los Angeles, had no oil, no minerals, no farmland. Its water came from Malaysia. Its unemployment rate topped 14%, and its per capita GDP was lower than Ghana's. Ethnic tensions threatened to rip society apart, and hostile neighbors doubted it could survive 5 years, let alone 50. Yet within a single generation, Singapore leapfrogged from slums and shipyards into a global powerhouse, a financial hub, the world's busiest port, and one of the safest cities on earth. Average income soared more than tenfold. Corruption was crushed, and the city-state's passport became one of the most powerful in the world. But Lee Kuan Yew saw danger in this very success. To him, prosperity was never permanent, and history was full of nations that fell the moment their people forgot how hard survival once was. That's why he wrote From Third World to First, not as a self-congratulation, but as a warning and a playbook for the future. Here are the great master of statecraft and diplomacy's own words about his memoirs.
I wrote this book for a younger generation of Singaporeans who took stability, growth, and prosperity for granted. I wanted them to know how difficult it was. For a small country of 640 square kilometers with no natural resources to survive, in the midst of larger, newly independent nations, all pursuing nationalistic policies. Those who have been through the trauma of war in 1942 and the Japanese, occupation, and taken part in building a new economy for Singapore are not so sanguine. We cannot afford to forget that public order, personal security, economic and social progress and prosperity are not the natural order of things, that they depend on ceaseless effort and attention from an honest and effective government that the people must elect. In my earlier book, I described my formative years in pre-war Singapore, the Japanese occupation, and the communist upheavals followed by racial problems. During our 2 years in Malaysia, the Japanese occupation, 1942 to 45, filled me with hatred for the cruelties they inflicted on their fellow Asians, aroused my nationalism and self-respect, and my resentment at being lorded over. My 4 years as a student in Britain, after the war, strengthened my determination to get rid of British colonial rule. I returned to Singapore in 1950, confident of my cause, but ignorant of the pitfalls and dangers that lay ahead. An anti-colonial wave swept me and many others of my generation. I involved myself with trade unions and politics, formed a political party, and at the age of 35 assumed office in 1959 as the first Prime Minister of an elected government of self-governing Singapore. My friends and I formed a united front with the communists. From the start, we knew that there would have to be a parting of the ways and a time for reckoning. When it came, the fight was bitter, and we were fortunate not to have been defeated. We believed the long-term future for Singapore was to rejoin Malaya, so we merged with it to form Malaysia in September 1963. Within a year, in July 1964, we suffered Malay-Chinese race riots in Singapore. We were trapped in an intractable struggle with Malay extremists of the ruling party, United Malay National Organization, UMNO, who were intent on a Malay-dominated Malaysia. To counter their use of communal riots to cow us, we rallied the non-Malays and Malays throughout Malaysia in the Malaysian Solidarity Convention to fight for a Malaysian Malaysia. By August 1965, we were given no choice but to leave. The communal bullying and intimidation made our people willing to endure the hardships of going it alone. That traumatic experience of race riots also made my colleagues and me even more determined to build a multiracial society that, would give equality to all citizens, regardless of race, language, or religion. It was an article of faith which guided our policies. This book covers the long, hard slog to find ways of staying independent and making a living without Malaysia as our hinterland. We had to work against seemingly insuperable odds to make it from poverty to prosperity in 3 decades. The years after 1965 were hectic and filled with anxiety as we struggled to find our feet. We were relieved when we found in 1971 that we had created enough jobs to avoid heavy unemployment, even though the British withdrew their forces from Singapore, but only after we weathered the international oil crisis in 1973. With the quadrupling of oil prices, were we confident that we could make it on our own? Thereafter, it was hard work, planning, and improvising to establish ourselves as a viable nation linked by trade and investments to the major industrial countries, and a successful hub for the dissemination of goods, services, and information in our region. Our climb from a per capita GDP of $400 in 1959, when I took office as Prime Minister, to more than $12,200 in 1990 when I stepped down, and $22,000 in 1999 took place at a time of immense political and economic changes in the world. In material terms, we have left behind our third world, problems of poverty. However, it will take another generation before our arts, culture, and social standards can match the first world infrastructure we have installed. During the Cold War, when it was far from clear in the 1960s and 70s which side would win, we aligned ourselves with the West. The Cold War divide made for a simpler international environment. Because our immediate neighbors were against the communists, we enjoyed both regional solidarity and international support from America, Western Europe, and Japan. By the late 1980s, it was clear we were on the side of the victors. This is not a how-to book, whether to build an economy, an army, or a nation. It is an account of the problems my colleagues and I faced and how we set about solving them. I wrote my earlier book as a chronological narrative. To do so for this volume would have made the book too long. I have written by themes to compress 30 years into 750 pages.
If you're interested in learning more about Lee Kuan Yew in his own words and through the perspectives of others, let us know in the comments. You can also support us on Patreon, link below, and become a channel member. Thank you.